Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here to join us, the Partnership of Historic Bostons, in another of our wonderful fall speakers series. Learn more about us if you don't already know at historicbostons.org. You can see all of our past talks. Tad's talk tonight is the last in our series this fall, and you can see what is coming up. So always something new happening at historicbostons.org. Now, just quickly say the way we'll work things tonight is, as usual, put your questions and comments into the chat. I will be monitoring it closely. And when Tad is done with his presentation, we will take questions. So I will be going through what you've written in the chat up to that point and relaying it to Tad. So that is how we will work that. And let me just introduce Tad to you. Tad Baker is a professor of history at Salem State University, and he has previously served as the vice provost and dean of the graduate school there. And he is the award-winning author or co-author of 6 books on the history and archaeology of early New England, including A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Witch Trials and the American Experience, and The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. Tad has served as a consultant and an on-camera expert for historical documentaries and TV shows for networks ranging from PBS and TLC to Smithsonian and the History Channel. So this recording that we're making tonight will be on the PHB website very soon afterward. So again, go to historicbostons.org and find everything you need to find there. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tad. Welcome and thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be with you all, and good to see some friends in the virtual audience out there. We'll see if we can share that screen. Can you all see my presentation? Laurie, thumbs up?
Yes. Yep, all looking good.
Excellent. All right. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is a project that I've been involved in one way or another much of my adult life, I guess. But in particular, this is the latest incarnation of it, at least, of looking at life in northern New England in the 17th century, really from a historical as well as archaeological and material, really the material life point of view. And specifically, actually, I'm going to see if I can make it disappear from my screen. Specifically, what this is, the project is called the Forgotten Frontier Project, and it's a project that we undertook starting in some ways about 5-6 years ago at the Old Berwick Historical Society, which is a small historical society in Maine and right on the New Hampshire border, which helped excavate my my site, the Chadbourne site, in the starting about 15-20 years ago, which is this amazing site that the turned into kind of an exhibit, the Forgotten Frontier exhibit, Untold Stories of the Piscataqua, where we at the counting house at Old Berwick Historical Society in South Berwick for a couple of years, we had an exhibit of materials relating to the Piscataqua in the 17th century, and really talking about it as a rich, diverse place to live, somewhat different than New England. It's what I call the other New England. And so I want to talk a bit about that project tonight, and the people in particular. And what you're seeing on the screen here actually is the exhibit catalog that the curator Nina Maurer and I put together. She was the curator, I was the project scholar, and it's actually includes a wonderful essay by Lisa Brooks as well on the native peoples of the Piscataqua, and an introduction by Jeff Bolster. So it's a fun project, but also too is really designed more for a general audience. And what I'm trying to work on now is kind of the maybe the trade book version of this story, basically telling the material life of this incredible family I want to introduce you to through their possessions and the possessions of their neighbors. So that's kind of the goal for the evening. And again, hopefully to paint a picture for you is, I think, Laura particularly asked for, like, hey, we know there's another New England out there, Tad, just keep talking about it. So talk about it. All right. So without further ado, this is much of the exhibit as it came to life back in summer 2017 at the Old Berwick Historical Society. I will say it was up for 2 years. There's a couple pieces of it in place now, but it's largely gone, but sort of not forgotten at all, as we say, because it's in the exhibit catalog. But it really tried to look at the lives of people of the Piscataqua region in the 17th century, really by looking at individuals and microhistories. And we originally went to pull the project together we got a team of people to talk about it. And of course, one of them we made sure was Laurel Ulrich. And as I knew she would say, she's like, Tad, you got to tell the story through people. It's got to be microhistory. So we kind of tell the story of the region through the lives of 8 people, largely those involved with the Chadbourne site and the Chadbourne family. And I guess the overall premise of all of this is, and a lot of my research is that Puritan New England was none of the above. And that really Maine and New Hampshire were the other New England, as I've long maintained that once you cross the Merrimack River going north, things really change to some degrees, maybe then as now. And in fact, of course, I've taught at Salem State this is my 29th year, but made the commute that time from here in Maine. So I think I know those two worlds reasonably well, and I think it's fair to say that they still have their differences. Anyhow, what do I mean by that? Well, not Puritan, because in northern New England, we have a variety of religious groups. Anglicans, Puritans, yes, some, but also substantial Quaker population, Baptist community, even other strange groups like Muggletonians, which, and more on them, and also godless fishermen, of course, at least what the people like Increase in Cotton Mather would say about the fishermen up here. I put that in quotes. And of course, people like Antinomians and others kicked out of Massachusetts. It's a place that one Massachusetts official complained was he called it a harbor for all the rogues in the country. I don't think it was quite that bad as they portrayed, but again, that was 17th century politics for you. So certainly the Puritans, Massachusetts Bay controlled this region. They take over New Hampshire in the 1642. They take over Maine in the 1650s. New Hampshire escapes in 1679, but Maine stays a part of Massachusetts until 1820. But it is kind of a forgotten frontier of Massachusetts Bay, one where they do have to allow for more diversity, I would say, particularly of religious belief, than they would allow in the traditional Bay Colony proper. So let's see. There we go. Not new. Again, people think about that. We realize this, right? Native inhabitants occupied the land for more than like 10,000 years. Actually, I think now more like 12,000 years. It's the latest figures. And frankly, probably going back well before that. We know that the glaciers are treated from New England about 12,000 years ago, and that we know that Native Americans followed them quickly into the region. We have sites in the region, again, close to 12,000-year-old Paleo-Indian sites, and not England, right? We're talking about a very diverse place beyond Native Americans. We have by early 1660s, we have African slaves. We have enslaved people in Maine. We also have probably enslaved Native Americans in the region. We have Scottish prisoners of war, Irish indentured servants, and many other Europeans. Yes, the English were the predominant population, but this was a reasonably diverse place. I think all of New England was in the 17th century, and particularly so in northern New England. So I want to start with a story that actually goes back before the exhibit to a book I wrote, gosh, about 15 years ago. And it's set on Great Island, which is today the town of Newcastle, New Hampshire. And it's actually called the Devil of Great Island. And it's about a tavern owned by a very interesting family, the Waltons, George and Alice Walton. They were Quakers. And George first comes to Exeter as an Antinomian in 1638, when the Antinomians, the so-called Antinomians, I shall say, sort of a term of derision used by the Puritans against them, right? With the time that they're thrown out of Massachusetts Bay, Anne Hutchinson and some others go south, and of course, George Wheelwright and others go north to Exeter. And then, by the way, when Massachusetts takes over Exeter in 1642, they actually, the Wheelwrights move to Wells, Maine, to sort of escape the Puritans. And it's only much later that Wheelwright will make amends with the colony and moves back to Salisbury. So the Waltons run we're talking about running, these are Quakers running a diverse and debauched tavern. The tavern that is supernaturally assaulted with flying stones throughout the summer of 1682. And I know this sounds like a novel, but this has got to be true because Increase Mather said it was so. But that's basically the premise of the Devil of Great Island. And to me, part of the story, in some degrees, it's a story, people think it's a story about witchcraft, but really witchcraft here is the lens to look at this other New England, right? So wait a second, Ted, a debauched Quaker tavern in New England in the 17th century? This isn't in any of our textbooks about New England or anything, right? But yeah, this was the case. And what do I mean by that? Debauched? Well, it's a rowdy tavern where there are complaints regularly registered against the drunken sailors and others who go to the tavern. There's the Walton's servant, Native American servant, Mary Agawam, again, probably maybe from the Ipswich area, and her bastard son, William, who was conceived Mary conceived with the help of an itinerant sailor on the Sabbath in the tavern. The Waltons, I call them the neighbors from hell, because one of the grandchildren drowns in an open well. I think it kind of today, the equivalent might be living next to a crack house, right? And also too, politically, these folks are the center of opposition to Massachusetts Bay. To some degrees, this plays into the story of why people are throwing stones at them, because if you look at all these reasons, why wouldn't you want to throw stones at them, right? If you're a good Puritan in New Hampshire in the 17th century. So when you have your tavern every night at 10 o'clock all throughout the summer of 1682, stoned, you quickly try to come up with an answer to who's doing this to you, and they immediately assume that their widowed Anglican next door neighbor, Hannah Jones, is supernaturally assaulting them with flying stones because she is in league with Satan. It's the logical explanation, of course, for the 1680s. And then there actually turns out, though, that the two families have been arguing over a piece of about a couple acres, basically, of marsh for almost 30 years. So it's kind of like the New Hampshire equivalent of Bleak House, one of these multi-generational lawsuits that never seems to end, which is clearly related to this whole case. And as if having Quakers and Anglicans as next door neighbors, it gets even more diverse than that, because the neighbor to the south is John the Greek Amazine, also known as John the Italian Amazine, meaning he's probably an itinerant sailor who made it to Portsmouth, where he marries one of the locals, probably was from southern Italy, one of the Greek enclaves in Italy, hence John the Greek, John the Italian. And then the neighbor on the other side is Walter Barefoot, who's an Englishman. And of course, that is his name. Barefoot is actually an English name, usually means for, well, the equivalent from Game of Thrones would be Snow is your last name, right? Refers to sort of an illegitimacy in the family. Walter Barefoot's an interesting fellow. He's a physician, and he is the physician. He's the fellow who stops the whipping of the Quakers out of the colony of New Hampshire down in, I believe it is Hampton, when they've already been whipped from like Dover through Exeter and down to Hampton I think that's in 1659. So again, you see an interesting range of people living even just on this part of Great Island in the 1680s. And interesting too here, then within a month, there are copycat incidents. The outbreak starts out on Great Island, Newcastle. And then within a month, it's spread upriver to Newishwanek, or the Berwick parish of Kittery, Maine at the time. And so in this case, where does it spread upriver to? It spreads to the home of Antonio Furtado, who's from Fayal in the Azores, another sailor who apparently came to stay. He and his wife Mary, who's the daughter of a West Country Anglican fisherman. So again, these are not your usual people that you run across in your standard narratives of Puritan New England, but they're there when you go looking for them. Others in the story have interesting characters as well too. The Waltons have this Irish servant, Dermot O'Shea. There are fishermen from Orkney Islands and the Channel Islands, and then really interesting people in the story is Reverend William Scriven and other Baptists who in 1682 are of course forming a Baptist church at Kittery Point, which is literally a stone's throw across the river from Great Island. And again, all these factors sort of explain what's going on Great Island, but you'll just have to read the book to learn more about that. Because what I really want to do is talk about the Forgotten Frontier and some other folks in this case. I think equally fascinating, if not more so than the Waltons. And by the way, as it turns out, actually are related to the Waltons. Waltons are related to the Chadbournes and the Shapleys as well. One of my favorite maps, the Scott map of the Piscataqua, drawn about 1665 by Colonel John Scott of Long Island. And it's an interesting representation of the region, certainly very, very colorful. You can see the present day boundaries there, really sort of shows the whole drainage and the nature of the settlement here, which is usually only one house deep back from the water. And then on the left, you'll see, again, this key, which basically tells you the reason this map was drawn was to tell you the location of all the sawmills in the region. So we're talking about a region where people came, frankly, not so much for religion, though many people who were thrown out of Massachusetts would end up here for those reasons, but particularly to commercially oriented and particularly towards lumbering, towards fishing, fur trading, and really, though it's northern New England that is the economic engine that provides the lumber and the fish that Boston and Massachusetts merchants use to really participate in the Atlantic trade, and it really sort of. And this is why, frankly, why the merchants take over New Hampshire and then Maine is because they need those territories to secure their economic advantage in the Atlantic world. So I want to focus in particularly, though, going upriver to present-day Berwick, Maine, or particularly South Berwick, Maine. And we're going to focus in on a detail from Scott's map showing Quampegan Falls. And this is the representation, probably not entirely accurate, but more accurate than I'd like to admit, because some of this map is really representational, but in this case, he seems to have captured this. The location of the Chadbourne family complex, a property that was destroyed in the Salmon Falls raid of 1690, and was I carried out 13 seasons of excavations there, excavating a lot of the site, and were able to find a house, a huge mansion house, outbuildings, a dairy, palisade fences, all sorts of fascinating stuff, and thousands of artifacts. The Chadbournes were to establish this house on land purchased from Sagamore Rowells in 1643. So in the exhibit, even before you meet the Chadbournes, you meet Sagamore Rowells, who is the Sagamore of Newichawanek, that is the Berwick and Rollins, present-day Berwick-Rollinsford region of the Salmon Falls River, which is the boundary between Maine and New Hampshire. Interesting to me too, because Chadbourne goes to the effort to purchase this land from Rowells. And it's clear that they have I would call it a relationship of respect, because in the deed and other places, he refers to Rowells not only as Sagamore, but also Mr. Rowells. And all of you out there who love the 17th century know that people did not just throw around the term Mr. or Mistress loosely in the 17th century. You know, normal folk would be good man and good wife. Most of us would be good man and good wife. And only the people who were kind of like the lower upper crust and up would be Mr. or Mistress. And so he is referring to Rowells as Mr., implying to me that this is a fairly mutual relationship between the two. And in fact, actually, the Chadbourne family purchases several parcels of land from Rowells. And this one is for a deed for 500 acres of land, including much of really kind of present day downtown South Berwick, Maine. Humphrey Chadbourne goes on to build a sawmill at the site, which is one of the earliest sawmills in the region. He and his father had apparently built Mason's first sawmill further up the Great Works River in 1634. And Humphrey does quite well for himself. He marries way above his station. His wife, Lucy, is a member of the Shapley family. The Shapleys are important West Country merchants. They are so wealthy, they contribute a ship to the campaign, the English war against the French in the late 1620s, early 1630s. And when they arrive in Maine, they arrive on their own ship to essentially their own kind of township, because in England, they live in Kingswear, which is across the river from Dartmouth in Devon, and their big residence and their wharf is right on the waterfront of Kingswear, and it's called Kittery. And it's from them, of course, that Kittery, Maine gets its name. So Humphrey arrives first and as a fur trader, carpenter, and then he marries into one of the wealthier families in the region. And he and Lucy and their family will do incredibly well for themselves. So much so that when Humphrey dies on the young side in 1667, his probate inventory we have, and it's fascinating. It doesn't have the detail I would like, but some of the large numbers that you're interested in seeing. 1667, a probate inventory of 1,713 pounds. Multi-millionaire by the standard of the day, right? I mean, the typical estate maybe 150, 200 pounds. And here, essentially, his sawmill alone is worth 300 pounds. Also too, you can see he's got beaver and other furs and money. He's fur trading as well too. And look at this, 5 serving men and maids. Indentured servants, you can tell by the value that they're only, the collection, the 5 of them are only worth 40 pounds and is differentiated. So those are all the 5 servants and the amount of years of service they have collectively at 40 pounds. But the point is to make this place work, you need lots of help. And you need forced labor like indentured servants, because you know what? People in their right minds really don't want to be lumberjacks and sawmill operators because it's hard, dangerous work. And why would you do that when you can get your own land of grant of 20 or 50 acres for little or no money, right? So this whole system is built on a really sort of a system of kind of a forced labor that starts with English, moves on to the Scottish, and of course will end up with enslaved Africans before too long. And we'll get to that in a minute. The site is pretty incredible because when it was destroyed, the family, I think, had to run out the back door as the French and their native allies ran in the front door. So lots of complete possessions. We found a whole pile of scrap iron from the sawmill, including a 5-foot-long pit saw blade, which was probably being reused for a sawmill blade, draw knives, hammers, hoes, you name it. Just incredible. And by the way, an enormous cost to conserve all these artifacts. I refuse to go to dig a site though unless I have a conservation budget, because it's really important to preserve these things. Other high status artifacts though, you know, again, like if you've read Kerry Carson's recent book, Face Value, we now know that the consumer revolution and the sort of the rising of the gentry and upper classes really begins in the 17th century, and that's true over here. And it's really clear that the Chadbournes are social risers. They are looking to be considered sort of members of the gentry, if you will. And they even have, almost every year at the dig, we seem to find a spoon. And this one in particular stands out because it's one of 7 surviving Hull and Sanderson spoons made by America's first silversmiths down in Boston. By the way, John Hull actually happened to own the sawmill a couple of miles upriver on the Salmon Falls, which ended up, of course, being inherited by his daughter and son-in-law. And of course, his son-in-law is none other than Witchcraft Judge Samuel Sewell. So close relationship actually to the family. And you can see right here, this silver spoon that we found again in the ruins of their house, which was left untouched until we found it in a hayfield. It had been abandoned in 1690, and they didn't even go back to try to find the silver spoon that they left behind. That's how rich these people were, at least at one point. And you can see the marks there, IH and RS, John Hull and Robert Sanderson. Of course, in the 17th century, the J's did not exist. The I was both a consonant and a vowel. So I could be for Ichabod, but it also can be for John, as in John Hull. And then right here, the keys, there's another, actually, that's Robert Sanderson's mark below. And then the circle on the top, HLC, Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne. So actually this says Hull and Sanderson's mark twice, and also Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne's monogram on it once. So it's kind of a wonderful thing to have, and the sort of thing you don't normally find on archaeology digs, but it was pretty exciting. And also, frankly, folks, a lot of archaeology today is about working with descendant communities, and a lot of that involves Native American or African-American populations. In this case, one of the major groups involved in this dig was the Chadbourne Family Association. And one of the more meaningful moments of my life was to be able to take this spoon and to hand it to Humphrey and Lucy's 9th great grandson. That was truly special. The Chadbournes clearly like to show their wealth and position. And so again, what I'm showing you here are some of the artifacts from the exhibit. And unfortunately, even though a lot of things are near to complete, most archaeologists mostly deal in small broken bits of stuff. So in the foreground here, you see the artifacts from the Chadbourne site. And on the left and in the background, you see complete pieces from local collectors who were very generous in loaning their materials to us for the dig and for the catalog. So on the left here, these pieces are some of the latest, most fashionable ceramics, English ceramics made in the 1680s. Only the au courant rich folk, again, those active participants in the rising gentry and consumer revolution, would have such stuff. On the left, we have an early example of the Chinese scholar pattern, which later on, of course, really becomes known as it's the forerunner of what's known as chinoiserie in the 18th century. And on the right, we have a Persian blue, which is really fascinating stuff because it is an English, it's most tin enameled earthenwares are blue on white decoration. This is white on blue, and it is meant to be an English imitation of a French imitation of Persian porcelain. known as Blue Persian or Persan Blue. Really, really fancy high-end stuff, because it's really important for the Chadbournes to tell their servants that, no, they're running things around here and you are just our servants, please, and go get back to work in the sawmill. They also, too, though, were involved in the Atlantic trade because they were shipping boards from their sawmill and probably also lumber for prefab houses, and also as well as codfish down to the Caribbean. I mean, they were lumber merchants, but I assume fish is going south too. We only have like one partial surviving account book for the Piscataqua region in the 17th century. So we have to kind of read between the lines. But this was one of the shocks that we found at the site. Osea polychrome ware, we found 4 plates of this fancy, rare Mexican-made ware. And here's a piece of it from the Florida Museum of Natural History, which helped me identify it. So they basically have a whole set of this stuff. This is not a rare souvenir that someone picked up on a trip to the Caribbean. But here's the point, folks. You shouldn't find it in New England, right? Because you're not allowed to trade with the Spain and the Spanish in the Caribbean. But clearly there's enough, if you think about it, there's enough Englishmen down there breaking all sorts of other navigation acts, like trading with the French, that why wouldn't they trade this with the Spanish too? So this is what Humphrey and Lucy are doing. They're bringing this really cool stuff back. These are the first examples of Spanish colonial wares from Mexico City that have been found in North America, anywhere north of Jamestown in the James River. But I suspect there's more of it out there, folks. Matter of fact, we have another pattern we think might be in the collections that we're still trying to get identified. It took me about 10 years to figure out what this was, so because we don't see it that much, right? Anyhow, so Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne, I think, were the kind of people I think we've all met. You know, you're invited over to dinner and you see the table set with this stuff. And you kind of go like, is that what I think it is? Well, yes, as a matter of fact. Well, where did you get that? Well, you know, we have our ways, you know, right? And they're reaffirming their status with their fancy rare stuff that other people can't get. But it also confirms what we all know is the New Englanders have been smugglers since day 1 or day 2, right? Okay, so Humphrey and Lucy are just kind of the center of this fascinating family that I really kind of stumbled across when I started excavating the Chadbourne site. At the time, really having no idea of who they were and what an amazing story there is. And again, it's their story that I'm now going to trying to tell tonight and in this book through their material lives, right? Because they are fascinating, fascinating folk. You can see here all the families in red own sawmills in the Piscataqua, and they are the leading families of the Piscataqua region. You're talking about the Cutts family of Cutts Island and of Portsmouth, of the Richard Cutts, who was the first governor of the colony of New Hampshire. You have Gilman of the Gilman Garrison over in Exeter. You have the Shapleys of Kittery. You have the Plaisteds of Berwick. Again, they're also related even to the Walton family as well. So this large group of people who are all the leading merchant elites, sawmill merchant elites of the Piscataqua, and they're all related to each other after you go about 2 or 3 generations in, as they try to solidify their place in society and as the ruling merchants of the region. One of the most interesting characters to me is Humphrey's sister, Patience. And so she and her husband, Thomas, were sort of, well, particularly Patience, were characters amongst the 8 characters in the exhibit, in addition to Humphrey and Lucy. These were interesting folk because Patience and Thomas were Quakers. And again, guess what? Quaker tavern keepers. So again, the family, these 3 artifacts were like 3 of sort of like the hallmarks of the exhibit that we found. Near the threshold of the Chadbourne house, really to bless it and protect it, we found an oak tree 2-pence dated 1662. Again, sort of showing that power of Massachusetts and Massachusetts authority. Humphrey Chadbourne was a Massachusetts Puritan, that is Massachusetts in the sense that he was a representative to the general court. So he represented the family on that side, but where ever-changing allegiances were, you needed to have all bets covered. So Humphrey was a Puritan. Lucy's brother, John Trewergy, was a Puritan merchant from Kittery, who was named governor of Newfoundland by Cromwell in the 1650s. So these are prominent, rich families with international connections. But you know, John's uncle, Humphrey's uncle-in-law, because it's Lucy's uncle, and Humphrey's sometime business partner is Nicholas Shapley. And he's the leading royalist of northern New England. Oh yeah, he's also a Quaker. We got a sort of a bit of a pattern here, don't we? and he's also leader of the local militia. Go figure that. So this is his harness boss, actually from Humphrey Chadbourne Jr., who was a royalist. So I use it to represent Nicholas Shapley in the exhibit, but it represents the royalist side of the family, because there's actually literally one meeting where Humphrey and the Shapleys are disenfranchised, and Humphrey can no longer serve as judge. So what happens? Nicholas Shapley replaces him as judge, and it's basically, or I'm sorry, the other way around. Nicholas Shapley is disenfranchised for being a Quaker, and Humphrey, his business partner, who's a Puritan, takes over for being a judge. So you see, the family is well positioned here, and they're right in the middle of the politics of the northern frontier. Also, at the trading post, we found this what the so-called Jesuit ring, which are trading rings that the French to the north would trade to the Wabanaki, who, of course, also traded at the Chadbourne site. And I'm sure this was left by one of them, or perhaps it was lost by someone the day when they destroyed the site in 1690. So part of the exhibit talks about Nicholas Shapley, Lucy's uncle, and Patience Spencer, Humphrey's sister, who are Quakers, and also very interesting people in their own right. And this is sort of the corner of the exhibit dedicated to them. Again, rowdy tavern keepers. From the general court records, listen to this and what happened. One set of the quarterly courts, these are all the cases that came up involving the taverns in Berwick. Daniel Goodwin confessed that he struck Humphrey Spencer on the head with a stool. Tavern keeper Goodwin admitted that he was drunk at the time. Two men admitted that they were in Gattenby's Tavern on the Lord's Day at the time of the sermon. We're not supposed to be at the tavern on the Lord's Day at the time of the sermon. The tavern is not supposed to be open. And then Nicholas Frost, this is like ripped from today's headlines, right? Nicholas Frost confesses he was so drunk, he tried to stab himself with his own knife. Frost confessed that he was in such condition that he did not remember what he did. How many times have we read this in the police blotter, right? And yes, the court, by the way, the court also met in the taverns because it was the biggest building. So the court heard these cases, met at Gattensby's. So this is what essentially, what the rowdy northern New England frontier. Now, having said this, Massachusetts taverns could get pretty rowdy as well, but this was perhaps more than the Puritans would have really cared to handle. But look at who these people are, right? Humphrey Spencer is Patience and Thomas's son. That's Humphrey's nephew and namesake. And Daniel Goodwin, there they are. And then Daniel Goodwin down here is Mehitable Plaisted's brother-in-law, Thomas Goodwin's brother. And all of these folks play prominently in the story, in this family. And John Gattensby, actually, he's not on this chart here, but yeah, he's Patience's son-in-law as well, Patience and Thomas's son-in-law. So all of these people running taverns, and by the way, some of these folks are probably Quakers too, are also running the taverns in town. Again, for the exhibit, we sort of attribute some of the artifacts from the Chadbourne site and also elsewhere from the region to the Spencer family. What we found here in Patience Spencer's probate inventory, we found multiple references to Lisbon Lisbon dishes. So we're talking about Portuguese faianca. And on the left, you see one of about a half dozen patterns from the Chadbourne site, who lived right across the river from Patience and her husband. So it's not surprising that if Humphrey would get the stuff, that he would either give it or share some or sell it to his sister. And on the right, we have another piece, again, with a full plate from a local collection. So frankly, the Chadbourne site, we have more patterns of Portuguese wares than we do English fine tablewares. And again, Portugal was a central in the Azores, central players in this Atlantic trade in the 17th century. The process that Peter Pope talks in his book about Newfoundland in the 17th century, that process of turning fish into wine, that is Atlantic cod into good Azorean and Portuguese wine. And also too, clearly not just wine coming back this way, but also some pretty high-end fancy ceramics as well. And we find this on most of the sites of the Piscataqua and Maine and New Hampshire. And again, a lot of it from Massachusetts as well too, because they're very much involved in this carrying trade. So again, you see these people are perched on the edge of the Atlantic world, but they're actively connected to Newfoundland, to Portugal, to London, to the Caribbean, and we're regularly shipping things around that region. Major Nicholas Shapley, even more fascinating fellow, right? Merchant, sawmill owner, Quaker, royalist, slaveholder. And also, so here you have a Quaker who's not a pacifist. These are early Quakers, right? He's the major in command of the Yorkshire militia. And his probate inventory is much more detailed than the Chadbournes. And so, like, look at this. He has 5 slaves, 5 enslaved Africans, worth 90 pounds. That's more like it for 5 people, not like the 40 pounds of the Chadbournes. And then look below that, 2 Irish boys, one to serve about 2 years, one 3 years. Fascinating, right? Because guess what? You need people to work your sawmills. And the first references we have to enslaved people, Africans, in the Piscataqua in York is in the early 1660s. And that's an important date, as we'll see, because it's only shortly afterwards the Scottish prisoners of war have become freed. Well, here's the deal. Royalists are desperately trying to keep Maine and New Hampshire independent from Massachusetts. And again, Major Shapley is the leading player in this effort. Part of it is for religious reasons. They want the ability to worship as they see fit, be they Quakers or Baptists or Anglicans. And so they're allowed to do that sort of, as we'll see. It's an interesting process. You can see the remains in Elliott of the Shapley Mill at low tide, their sawmill. And we know a little bit more about it. We know, again, we actually know the name of at least one of those enslaved Africans. His name was William Black, and we have we know a name of another one here, Cuffy or Coffee. We actually have from the Suffolk deeds in 1675. We have the deed where Shapley buys Cuffy from a plantation in the Barbados. William, and you can see a copy of that deed there under our part of the William Black and his role in the exhibit. No, we don't know what William Black looked like. And Nina sort of talked me in off the ledge, and we use representative people of the time from paintings of the 17th century. This is actually a Dutch painting showing kind of a working class African, perhaps enslaved, perhaps free in Amsterdam in the mid 17th century. Gives you an idea maybe of what William Black might have dressed like, might have sort of appeared like. And what's interesting here is, we know that William Black is, again, fascinating character. He ends up, we have a part of the exhibit on him. And we know that he became a farmer who, working on the 100-acre farm that he bought from the Frost family of Frost Hill, and yes, that's Robert Frost's ancestors, before he even became free. He bought the land in 1695, probably started working it, and then in 1700, the Shapley family freed him. We are not sure if he had to pay for that privilege or if they just became enlightened. And perhaps as Quakers, they finally decided that was not a good thing to have enslaved people. But having said that, they kept lots more enslaved people well into the 18th century. Because again, you need someone to run the sawmill, because anybody who can become free, like Black Will, who changes his name, of course, to Will Black, is going to go buy land and set up themselves and be their own farmers. So in this case, we use, we have near complete milk pans, but my friend Martha Sollier, who used to be one of the potters at Plymouth Plantation, made a nice replica milk pan for me. And then also too, we had cowbells, which again, Nina convinced me, like, Tad, no one's going to recognize that cowbell or that hoe. So we had replicas made by a really good blacksmith who works in 17th century materials. To continue on with the family, William, to me, this is really fascinating, because going down another generation, William Black's son, William Black Jr., actually ends up, well, marrying or being a partner. We don't have any reference to the wedding taking place per se, but they were allowed to cohabit and live and raise a family in Maine peacefully. So essentially, we have the son of a slave marrying the granddaughter of the family that were helped to enslave them, right? So all part of that family tree, because Nicholas Shapley is right up here as Patient's sort of uncle-in-law by marriage, right? So again, unheard of, I think, to have that kind of sort of, shall we say, social mobility and tolerance. sort of speaks to the diversity of the region. The previous force of forced labor before Africans was, of course, Scottish prisoners of war. We know there were about 400 of them taken at the Battle of Dunbar and Worcester, 1615, 16, well, literally thousands taken prisoners by Cromwell and by the English. But they end up over those two battles, ship a small number of them and end up a total of about 400 to the Saugus Iron Works, where they're sort of jobbed out to work in the heavy industries of Massachusetts and New England. And a lot of them end up working in Maine and New Hampshire, operating the sawmills and being lumberjacks, where they serve 5 to 7 year indentures. And again, if you think about it, these fellows become free 1657, 1658. And I think I say the first reference I found to an enslaved African in Maine is 1662. This is not a coincidence, right? We need a controllable labor force that we can put to work in the heavy labors of the sawmills and places like the Saugus Ironworks. And below here, we actually have a spoon of one of those Scots. As it happens, Thomas Holmes was the Scot who, when he became freed, became a sawmill operator, if not owner. It's a little unclear if he actually owned the sawmill, which happens to be at the side of the Counting House Museum. And when they were putting in a fish ladder, the workers found the spoon below and threw it up to the then president of the board, thinking as a joke, saying, "You want some old stuff? Here, have this old spoon." And it really is, yeah, a late 17th century spoon that probably was from the Holmes family, whose house was destroyed on that Salmon Falls raid. So we actually have one artifact that relates to Thomas Holmes, who was one of those Scots. The Scots become very important in this region. There's so many of them that migrate to the region. In 1711, we have a militia list for Berwick, and 25% of the heads of household in 1711 are Scottish surnames, just either those very elderly Scots prisoners of war or their descendants, right? And of course, here where I live in York, there's a section of town that's known as Scotland, where they settled early on. So we have, you can see the different range of people we have here, and we'll have another piece of diversity enter here too. The region is pretty peaceful until 1675, of course, when King Philip's War breaks out. And again, we could spend a whole night just talking about that, and particularly what's going on in Maine, which is a little different than the South. But suffice it to say, the Chadbourne house is attacked in 1675, and we found flattened musket balls there. They're able to fend off that attack, but they're not so lucky in 1690, when the Salmon Falls raid takes place in the early stages of King William's War, one of the most devastating raids, frankly, pretty much on par with Deerfield. 109 killed, 44 taken captive, is pretty horrifically high numbers. Interesting thing is this raid actually is the dress rehearsal for Deerfield. Winter raid pre-dawn via snowshoe, and it's led by Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville. And we actually have his portrait that survives up in Canada. Why does his portrait survive? Because he becomes, at the time, I'm sorry, Hertel de Rouville leads the Deerfield raid in 1704. I'm matter of fact, this is his father who led the Salmon Falls raid. I'm sorry. But they use the same tactics. And in fact, he'll be knighted in 1716, but he's a young boy. He's like 16 when he accompanies his father on the Salmon Falls raid. But it's that tactic, attack before dawn, come in the winter when no one's expecting you, overland, really horrible march down from Quebec, gather your native allies, attack the settlement, kill as many as possible, take others captive. So again, the French could be neighbors and traders and smugglers that you worked in partnership with, but also too, there were times when they were your bitter enemies and attacking your house and destroying it. So this is what I call unsettling times. This is times when the frontier gets rolled back and you have all these migrants, people forced out of their homes to be refugees in places like Portsmouth and Boston and Salem. And yeah, a bunch of them were involved in the Salem witch trials. And here we talk about well, basically the end of the story in some degrees is that Berwick is almost destroyed in this raid, and it won't be the same for many, many years. It's kind of the bleeding edge of the frontier. But the Salem witch trials indeed really were triggered in part by this frontier fighting in King William's War. And the example I give is Mercy Short, who was one of those captives, women taken captive, actually teenagers taken captive on the raid in 1690. Most of her family is killed. She's marched off to Canada in captivity. She's forced to convert to Catholicism in Quebec. We think forced. She's ransomed by Phipps in 1690 on his Quebec expedition. And in 1692, she's an afflicted girl in Boston after she is cursed by Sarah Good in one of the Boston jails. And how does she describe to Cotton Mather what Satan looked like? She says, oh, Satan was a black man, actually, or tawny, like an Indian. And that she's clearly reliving the trauma of when she lost most of her family on that raid that just forever and irreparably changed her life and really kind of ruined it. Anyhow, I promise not to turn this into a Salem witch trials talk. But I do want to talk about religion to start to kind of wrap things up. If you look at the religions of these people, again, this has sort of struck you how diverse these folks are. I mean, you have Humphrey and Lucy, and again, they are Puritans. They have to, I think in some degrees, they had to be Puritans to be the leaders of the family to the Puritan cause in Massachusetts Bay. But it's clear that other members of the family didn't share that allegiance. Again, Major Nicholas Shapley is a royalist and is a Quaker, along with the Spencers, as well as other members of the second and third generation, too numerous to mention here. And yeah, Richard Leader, Muggletonian. Muggletonians are one of these small, very private and quiet radical sects that emerge out of the English Civil War, that are basically millennialists expecting the second coming of Christ to take place in the 1650s. Amazingly, when it didn't, the order went underground but stayed in existence until about the 1960s when the last Muggletonian died, and he left all the ledgers of all the order over the years. So these are really, really radical folks. And by the way, yeah, I think J.K. Rowling, I'd love to meet her and ask her, because I think she knew perfectly well who Muggletonians were, and I think that's where she gets Muggles. But again, another Sawmill family that are religious radicals. And then look at all the Baptists. Oh my gosh. Again, the Cutts family, one of the leading families of New Hampshire, and Lucy Chadbourne's own daughter, Joanna Wells, by her second husband. By the way, her second husband is an enslaver. He has a slave, an African slave in his probate inventory from the 1680s. And then look on the other side of the family, Reverend William Scriven. In 1682, the Boston Baptist Church authorizes the establishment of a Baptist church in Kittery Point, Maine. Now, actually, believe it or not, despite this tolerance, somehow the Quakers are basically harassed out of Maine, because within a couple of years, this congregation in Kittery Point, led by Scriven, will have decided that they can't handle Maine anymore. So what do? They go south. They go to Charleston and surrounding areas of South Carolina. And William Scriven and the people who went with him from Maine and New Hampshire are considered the founders of the Southern Baptist movement. That's right, folks. You heard it here first. The Southern Baptist movement essentially started in Kittery Point, Maine in 1682. So how does that mess up your thinking about life in New England in the 17th century? One last thing I wanted to mention, and that is the diversity is not just religious and is not just different nationalities, but is within the English population that comes to New England in the 17th century, because we tend to think of this as being an East Anglian Puritan-dominated group who build hall and parlor houses. Well, yeah, no, not entirely. Yes, a majority, over 50% of the settlers to New England were East Anglians and others from southeastern England, that sort of stronghold of the Puritans and hall and parlor houses, what Abbott Lowell Cummings refers to as the Massachusetts House Plan. But we know that the second largest group, about 20% of the immigrants to New England, come from the West Country of England, right? That sort of finger or arm or leg sticking out into the Atlantic, the Southwest, and you can see the numbers. This is from Banks's dictionary. Those numbers for each county tell you the number of immigrants coming in the Great Migration to those regions. In Maine and New Hampshire, the figures are probably 50% or higher. Very high percentage of West Countrymen here. And in the 17th century, Englishmen are loyal to their county, to their community. They are not Englishmen in that sense. And they bring with them regional ways that are very, very different. And they even involve your religious beliefs. The West Country is a stronghold of the Church of England and also of dairy farmers. And it's a very different place than those people from East Anglia. And to give you a sense of that, by the way, Lucy Chadbourne is amongst those folks. She comes from Dartmouth region. The family are actually originally, before Kingswear, they are actually the mayors of Totnes, which is about 10 miles upriver from Kingswear. And so, and it's no surprise on the archaeology side of the Chadbourne site, It's the first site, I think, again, north of Virginia, where we found Totnes ware. Well, maybe outside, except for Newfoundland, where it's also found, which again makes sense because the family was up there. And also all kinds of North Devon ceramics and other artifacts from the West Country, because the trade patterns continue with the West Country throughout the 17th century into the 18th century. This was not just a London-dominated trade, but this is a trade in New England that is also significantly ties to Bristol and West Country ports like Plymouth and Dartmouth. And here's actually a replica plate that Martha Sellier made for me of North Devon sgraffito. And yeah, here's a cloth seal from the Chadbourne site made in Somerset, 1671. So again, these are ongoing connections with the West Country. And just to sort of show you the amount, how much the volume of this is, and to work in sort of to close in one last site. Different types of architecture in Maine. We know there are West Country forms of architecture, including West Country longhouses, including a longhouse excavated in Woolwich, Maine by my dear late friend Bob Bradley from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission back in the 90s. The Phipps longhouse, built by Sir William Phipps's father, measured 15 feet wide, 72 feet long, and the family lived in the upper end of this longhouse, and the livestock, their cattle, lived in the lower end. And we have the soil tests to prove that, believe it or not. Now, this was not out of place in the 17th century. It wasn't really considered truly old-fashioned at the time to share your house with your livestock. By the 18th century, it kind of become old-fashioned. But again, we know that this style of architecture, West Countrymen built this sort of house in Maine in the 17th century. And frankly, probably some West Countrymen built places like this in Massachusetts too. They just disappeared really quickly and they don't survive because they were quickly replaced for lots of reasons, but that's a whole nother talk. And also too, we found literally thousands of pieces of North Devon ceramics from the West Country shipped out of Bristol and the ports of North Devon. Towns like, familiar names to you, like Barnstable and Biddeford in Devon, where these potteries were at work. And this stuff is being transshipped across the Atlantic. And this is, just to end with, these are some artifacts from the Demers collection, which was a collection of largely ceramics, thousands of pieces that were raised by sport divers off Newcastle, Maine in the 1970s by a father-son team of sport divers. They don't have much provenance, but it's incredible for how complete a lot of these pieces are. And what I'm showing you here is about half the collection of North Devon gravel tempered wares that they excavated, but it is one of the largest collection of North Devon ceramics outside of North Devon, I would hazard to guess. And some of the stuff dates to the early 18th century, including lots of North Devon sgraffito ware, tableware, which are forms and styles here that probably were made around 1690, 1700, maybe 1710. In other words, large, extensive connections between the West Country of New England and at the very least northern New England, but I would hazard to guess probably further to the south as well, well into the 18th century, at a time when we were sort of told that, oh no, London and Boston have sort of dominated the trade. Well, horse feathers, absolutely not. So anyhow, I've said more than enough, and I hope you've enjoyed this maybe somewhat different view of early New England, and I couldn't resist showing this slide, particularly with Thanksgiving coming up next week. So thanks. I will now stop my screen share, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ted, for that talk. And we'll get right into the questions. We have two different questions coming in that are both, they're related to one major question, which is, how is Massachusetts allowing all of this? Maine was not a separate colony. I believe it was under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. So we have one question saying, did the judges from Boston have any jurisdiction really in Maine? Did they treat them differently? There was no kind of control that Massachusetts could exert over them? So,
well, here's the deal. Of course, Maine, first off, when towns like where I live here in New York, when they agreed to become part of Massachusetts in 1652, it initially wasn't by choice. In 1651, Sir Ferdinand of Gorges, the proprietor of Maine, dies in 1649. 2 years later, 1651, a deputation led by Simon Bradstreet, better known as the husband. Okay, he was later governor, but I like him better known as the husband of one of America's great poets, Anne Bradstreet. When he led a delegation that came north here to York, where, by the way, Thomas Morton had only died a couple years before. His final resting place is here in York. So you can see it was like a royalist kind of place. And they came in a couple years after Sir Ferdinand of Gorges died and said, hey, things aren't going so well for you folks. Why don't you join up with Massachusetts? I said, yeah, thanks, Simon, but no thanks. We're good here. I said, okay. They came back the next year and they said, so another year, things are going terrible, right? Time to join Massachusetts? No, Simon, we're doing just fine. Basically, Simon said, wow, I'm sorry to hear that. And you know who's going to be really sorry to hear that and upset at that? The Essex County Cavalry that I've left down in Portsmouth. At which point people in New York said, where do I sign? How do I become part of Massachusetts? We really want to. But having said that, when they did that, they extracted some concessions. And basically, you could be allowed at that point to be a free man in the same kind of concessions actually that New Hampshire got a few years earlier. In order for Massachusetts was willing to sort of take the region, again, have political control over it, but not full control, because it was important for them economically. So they basically, up here, you were not required, or they basically acknowledged that they would not enforce the requirement that you had to be a member of the church, the Puritan church, to be a free man. It was basically adult property holders, right? So that's vastly different. And that means that it's kind of the status quo where the leading elites, be they Anglicans or Puritans or Quakers, are going to be largely allowed to rule things. And it's only that one case, literally, where at one point they have the majority of and of course, you know, in the county courts, right? County courts are drawn locally. In Essex County, the Essex County courts, judges are from Essex County. They are actually the representatives from the general court from Essex County. Same thing too in the province of Maine, which becomes the county of York. Now I'll tell you this, the name itself is a name given in shame. They name York, they name, make Agamenticus and turn it into York. They make Falmouth and turn it they take Casco and make it Falmouth. They take Scarborough, Blue Point and Black Point and make it Scarborough. Those are all some of the last royalist strongholds to fall during the English Civil War. And they're basically making fun of Maine by imposing names of royalist defeats on the town, right? But politically, they do have a fair amount of sway here because, again, as long as they behave, to some degrees, I think I equate it to don't ask, don't tell. You know, Massachusetts, all they really care about is as long as we control the place and we get the lumber out of there and we don't have too many public outcries. And at one point, when they end up with a majority of selectmen in Kittery and a majority of judges in York County being Quaker, they say, no, we have to throw one or two of you off the bench because we can't let you control things, but we're not gonna, and we'll occasionally, if you don't come to meeting, you're gonna occasionally get into trouble. And we see, for example, both Shapley and the Spencers are charged with not attending worship on the Sabbath, right? But it only happens like once every 4 or 5 years, so they're not, I think it's a token effort. Again, I think it's occasionally like, okay, we have to show our muscle. So, yep, we're going to bring him to court. And then like, okay, we proved our point. So just let it live. So I think that's kind of what's going on here, where it's more important for them to have control over the region, but they're willing to accept this kind of like, this divided politicism. And that's kind of what I'm kind of dealing with in this paper. And it actually was, it was one of those, it was a guy from Dover who was an arch Puritan, Major Richard Waldron, who actually, again, is one of the chief villains of King Philip's War in Lisa Brooks's book, because he's the one that has the false treaty where a number of, like 300 or 400 Native Americans are seized under false pretenses in King Philip's War and enslaved or executed, many of them. But he's the guy that says, this place is the harbor for the rogues of all nations. He's writing to the Massachusetts General Court complaining. And I think Massachusetts is going, yeah, okay, Waldron, just shut up and deal with it,
So another question we have is, it isn't as if people were emigrating straight from England to Maine. Weren't people coming up from Massachusetts? Didn't the people in what is now Maine have family who, like, they were from Massachusetts and they were still in contact with this? And how did they develop such a different culture?
Some did and some didn't, right? I mean, up until there was almost no migration from Massachusetts in Maine until Maine is taken over by Massachusetts. And if you consider that the first year-round fishing stations were in the Piscataqua and in Maine, well, Damerscove Island, Maine, 1622. Of course, next year, Portsmouth is celebrating its 400th anniversary because of course, Rye, which was then was Panaway Plantation of David Thompson. We've heard of Thompson Island and Boston Harbor, but few people want to admit the fact that Thompson first settled in in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, before then deciding to move south. So people were living here from the 1620s and regularly by like 1630 or 1631 onward. The Hiltons have their fishing station at Dover Point by like the mid to late 1620s. And again, one of the brothers, of course, started off in Plymouth and then skedaddled out of there, again, because of, guess what? Differences with people in Plymouth. So the first generation of settlers are not Puritan for the most part. They're a mixed bag. There are lots of Anglicans. There are people from the West Country. There's fishermen. There's folks loyal to the crown. And it's only when Massachusetts takes over in New Hampshire in the 1640s and Maine in the 1650s that members kind of the second generation of Massachusetts will start moving into the region. And that causes a huge political squabble that is ongoing. And I'll talk about this in The Devil of Great Island, when like in the 1650s and 60s, when they finally get a Puritan minister and they decide to reorganize the seating in the Portsmouth Meeting House. And the old Anglicans get really angry at that. One walks in and rips up. They put the names in the places, and one guy goes, "No, you didn't. We're not doing that." And he rips up the reseating plan. So there is an ongoing sort of like struggle between those factions for decades. And again, in some places, Massachusetts is stronger. By the early on, they can't find enough ministers to come up to Maine because there aren't enough Harvard graduates who want to do that. And then when they finally get them up here, it's in the 1680s and 1690s. So finally, Massachusetts has its first real Puritan minister, Shoebile Dummer, he doesn't arrive until the 1680s. And the Puritans who've moved up from York from Massachusetts are going like, please, 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 could we have a minister? Because the guys they have before are pretty scurrilous, questionable lot. Sometimes practicing all kinds of weird groups. Sometime just look up Reverend George Burdett, and if you want to hear about an interesting guy who was apparently described as an early practitioner of free love in Dover, New Hampshire, and York, Maine, in the 1630s and early 1640s. And the last reference that is made to him, I think, by Thomas Gorges when he's governor, is he said basically he was last seen at Pemaquid waiting to be deported back to England, and he was sitting there basically drinking, gaming, and dancing. Good Anglican minister. So it's very much a divided land, and it takes until the late 17th, early 18th century before most people here are what we consider to be mainstream Puritan. But even there, you still have a Quaker presence and others as well too, and certainly some Anglicans.
You mentioned slavery many times and the grotesque and mistaken belief that you had to enslave people to do the work of this land. Someone's question is, were the settlements in Maine that you're looking at part of the larger network of slavery? Like, were they in touch with like you say, there are Quaker slaveholders? Of course, this is before the Quakers adopted their anti-slavery policy. Were they, in this horrible trade with places like Newport or other locations like that?
So I haven't gotten into the 18th century. The ones I find, the slaves, the only one we know for sure where he came from is Cuffy, we know he came from the Barbados. We were assuming at this point that but it's interesting. If you look at that deed, the intermediary in it is a Boston merchant, right? So I think basically, all of these merchants in Maine, many of them, by the way, will move up. They're Boston merchants who have, again, like John Hull, like Samuel Sewell, like Thomas Clark and Thomas Lake on Arousac Island, Maine, who I spent a lot of time studying years ago. All of these folks are Boston, many of them are Boston merchants or have ties to Boston merchants. And I think basically they're all part of the same network, but we do know that some of the merchants in Maine do have direct connections to the Barbados. One of the fellows I didn't get to talk about on this family tree, John Hole, is a merchant who's from Barbados who comes up here and marries into this extended family network. And he clearly is like his family are sugar plantation owners in Barbados. And I think, one of these places I want to go, maybe some winter, is down to Barbados to see what we can find in the records of more connections directly or indirectly between enslaved Africans and people owning plantations and connections in Barbados, and maybe even, like places like Jamaica, and see what ties we can come up with on this end, because there's a lot of primary sources down there that are not published anywhere, like the probate inventories, right? Where you can find things like people mentioned in some of these estates, enslaved Africans and then so you could track them up here. So it's a really, we don't know a lot about it, but it clearly is an extension of the slave trade that's going on throughout New England. But I just want to make it clear to me that, like, on the one hand, I think we seem to think that, oh, slavery wasn't so bad in New England. These were house servants and status symbols. Yeah, maybe. But I think a lot of these folks, unfortunately, were doing the heavy, horrible, nasty work that no one who was free labor was willing to do, or you wouldn't pay them enough to be willing to do it. Again, not a large part of the population, right? Again, it's not like we're talking about plantation slavery where you have dozens of enslaved people. You're talking about a family like Nicholas Shapley having maybe like 5 enslaved Africans, maybe being kind of like the limit in the 17th century. In the 18th century, though, some of these other families, like the Pepperells, who are also related here to all these other folks, have 10 or 15 enslaved people in the 18th century. So it's growing. And clearly, as people gain more wealth, more may become household servants. But it's a pretty insidious system. And we know, I think, and Dudley, when he's doing he's describing New Hampshire and around, because remember at the time, the governor in the early 18th century, the governor of Massachusetts also was kind of like the governor of New Hampshire, but he has a deputy governor. I think there's something like by 1710, something they're saying like maybe 100 enslaved Africans on the New Hampshire side of the river. So it's not an insignificant number by any stretch, right? And again, we're only really beginning to really understand that and try to figure those people out.
Right. And perhaps more indigenous enslaved people than African.
Yes.
Someone is writing in about Wabanaki enslavement.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Enslavement at its heart is about taking advantage of other and somehow believing that other are somehow less human than you, right? So, Native Americans usually aren't enslaved in place. In fact, any more so than Africans would be, any more than Europeans would be. I mean, 1,000 years ago, there was the Trans-Saharan slave trade in which you took West Africans, and you shipped them by camel over to the Mediterranean, where they became enslaved by Europeans. And then you got European prisoners of war going back the other way. It's all about, somehow it seems to be okay to do this to people who are different than you, right? Who are a different faith, a different skin color, who speak differently than you. And if you do that when you capture prisoners of war, like in King Philip's War, you don't enslave them in New England. Where do you enslave them? They go down to the Caribbean. And of course, there's been a lot of really, really good research on that. There are remnant populations, descendant communities of New England Native Americans down there. But we also do have this other process that does tend to take place locally, and that is debt peonage. Margaret Newell's book on the origins of sort of slavery in New England, which also looks a lot at Native American enslavement, talks a lot about this. But we know in Essex County and certainly probably in Maine, we have debt peonage. As a matter of fact, George Walton probably has debt peonage at the very least over the Agawam son, because he is not a free man. He's basically raised at the Walton Tavern, and he doesn't seem to become free until he's well into adulthood, like in his 20s. Because again, there's this situation of, oh, you become into debt. Well, then, you're going to have to work for us till you pay it off. And well, you don't have a way to pay it off because you're working for us 7 days a week. Isn't that too bad? Right. So yeah, enslavement can take many forms. And I also sometimes, honestly, I refer to forced labor because some of these ways, especially with some of the Native Americans, it's hard to tell where you cross the line between, bonded servitude with an end to that, or someone who is somehow enslaved for life, right? Yeah.
2 quick questions. First, can information about the families in this area that you're focusing on be found at the Counting House Museum? And are you going to be writing a book about this? And is the Richard Leader in your kinship charts related to the Richard Leader who is director of the Saugus Iron Works?
Yes, after he leaves Saugus, his next operation is the Great Works Sawmill on the Great Works River, where he builds this huge gang saw operation that apparently never really worked right. So, and by the way, it's having Leader up here in Maine with his connections to Saugus that starts the pipeline of Scots coming up to work in his sawmill and the other places in the region. So yes, and there's also his brother is up here as well too. So you will find no original 17th century sources at the counting house. If you're interested in the genealogy of these people, of all Maine and New Hampshire people in the 17th century, the critical starting place, Libby, Noyes, and Davis Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire. I don't know, it's probably 900 or 1,000 pages long, and it gives specific details on all of these folks, linked to probably several hundred documents, lists of settlers, things like that, shows the connections between them, and is like the starting place for all of these families. And essentially, most of the documents we know about were discovered by Libby, Noyes, and Davis in the 1920s when they were doing the research on this book. And I've only found one or two errors in this book, if that. So it's incredibly reliable for the genealogies on those people. And I'm fleshing out some of those genealogies on some of these specific families, but still a lot of work to do there too. So that's where we go now. And am I writing a book on it? Yes. Unfortunately, when I started my sabbatical last January, when I went back to the faculty from being vice provost, I started off with one book to write, which is the story of these people told through their material possessions, their material lives. Somehow by the end of sabbatical in the spring, I had 4 books to write. So working on it, but there's also going to be that book on the FIP site that I promised I would write, because my late friend Bob can't do that. Also, I have to write this book on historic beers of the 17th century and recreating them, sort of half cookbook, half history book. And then I also am working on a sequel to Storm of Witchcraft, which is going to be about about the aftermath of the witch trials, kind of like the later chapters of Storm of Witchcraft, but a full book on really loss and trauma and healing from 1692 to present. So it's coming, but it'll be a while for all of those before. So be patient, folks, sooner or later.
All right. Well, following on from that last one, someone is asking, why was York, Maine such a site of conflict that eventually led to the attack on York that drove some people to Salem, and well, people who were related to people in Salem who suffered from that? What was it about that? Who had lived there? What was about that settlement site?
Yeah, and by the way, we do really say, and I'm looking out my window and it's dark, but I'm looking out at Snowshoe Rock, which is where the York raid commenced, where the Native Americans encamped the night before the attack. So it's a good place for someone like me to live. In fact, actually that raid I see as the trigger event for the Salem witch trials, of course, because who's killed on that raid, but Reverend Shubile Dummer, who is Samuel Sewell's first cousin, and is the first Puritan minister to die by the Native Americans. Remember before, like Reverend Rowlandson had only been held captive, right? And wasn't, actually he wasn't, was he? It was just his wife, right? Wasn't it? Yeah, they didn't get him. But still, ministers' wives, and no ministers died. So that seems to be a whole new thing. But having said that, York is not unique by any stretch. If you look at the raids in the history of King William's War, and there is one that's out there that's not bad, but I'd like to see one focused just on New England, frankly. Mary Beth Norton talks about it some in A Devil's Snare, but she and I both agree that we really need someone. Could someone out there please write a history of King William's War in New England, please? It's desperately needed. One of the first global wars. Pretty much they're picking off every frontier town they can, and they start up the coast. The first attack actually is on Cocheco, Dover, New Hampshire, which starts the war in early 1689, summer 1689. Then they pick off the easternmost settlement at Pemaquid. Then they have a multiple raids where they pick off York, they pick off Falmouth or present-day Portland, Maine, and most of these places, including Salmon Falls, pretty much every town in between about 1689 and 1700 is attacked at least once, and that even includes a couple of raids on different parts of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And some of them, there's a devastating raid on Rye Beach, where probably about 15 people are killed in the mid-1690s. So no place was safe. It's just York gets the focus because I think it was the trigger event for the war, and also because so many people were taken on it. Numbers that frankly it doesn't get neither the Salmon Falls raid or the York raid, or for that matter the Durham raid, get the publicity that Deerfield does, because it doesn't have the historians writing on it 100 years ago with as much street cred, I guess. But you're talking collectively between all those raids, probably about over 500 people killed or taken captive in Maine and New Hampshire just during King William's War. So It's not just York.
What, it seems like there were many families in this region who were very wealthy and powerful. What prevented Maine from sort of rising up to become more of a powerhouse and maybe even to rival Massachusetts?
Yeah,
Why
well,
didn't it ever break through?
Now, years ago, I wrote an essay for a book I edited on the link called "The Land of Norumbega: Exploration, Culture, and Cartography." American Beginnings: The Land of Norumbega: Exploration, Culture, and Cartography. And I wrote an essay about Thomas Gorges, who was the royalist governor of the province of Maine in York, 1640, 1641, 1642. He decides to go home and actually fight for. He's actually a parliamentarian in the wars, even though he's Sir Ferdinand Gorges' kinsman. But I talk about him coming here, and at the time, frankly, when he arrives in 1640, if you had to bet on who was going to be the leader and who was going to be the follower, you'd say that the province of Maine would be the leader and Massachusetts would be the follower, because Massachusetts has all the natural resources. We have the fish, the fur, the lumber. And I think part of the problem is that the loss of the English Civil Wars kind of cripples northern New England. And then to make matters worse, on top of that, the region is literally devastated in King Philip's War, in King William's War, in Queen Anne's War. And by the way, that's wholesale destruction of Native American and English settlements. It is a burnt over ruin where after about the Second War, many people, Native Americans and Europeans, said, yeah, I've had enough. I'm not coming back, right? Some of those families left after King Philip's War and went to places like Salem and never came back, and were later on involved in the witch trials. So I think part of it is because of the unsettled nature of the politics here, the constant machinations of Massachusetts to take it over, and the fact that you have all of the richest people up here are Boston merchants who then become elected to the general court. They are never going to let hold of their lease on the region. Even the Royal Commission, there's the Royal Commission of 1665, which comes over to New England to sort of explore and look and see. Basically, they're looking to see like, hey, Massachusetts, you're misbehaving. Let's take a look at that charter and think about taking it away from you, which of course they eventually do in the 1680s. But these are the first steps towards revocation of the charter. But they come to Maine and New Hampshire, and they quite deliberately agree to take, they kind of agree like, yeah, Massachusetts should not be able to control Maine and New Hampshire. But nothing ever happens about it. And then frankly, the killer blow here is in 1677, Massachusetts tracks down Sir Ferdinand Gorges' grandson and namesake, Ferdinando, and buys Maine from him. And at the same time, this is the same time when the king, in this case, let's see, Charles II, is taking away New Hampshire from Massachusetts and installing it as a separate colony, again, led by President Cutts and his council. And essentially, that's the whole story of actually Devil of Great Island. But unfortunately, Massachusetts beats the king to the punch before he can free the province of Maine from the Gorges family. They purchase title to Maine, at which point they go like, we own it. And there's no way they're really able to supplant that, of course, until Maine becomes a state in 1820. Yeah. And I will tell you, it's a fascinating place because the politics remain different. So there's an independence movement that starts in Maine, really like in the 1780s and 90s. And here the merchants are Jeffersonians. They're not Federalists because the Federalists run Massachusetts. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So you have all of these folks up here, including actually, there's a member of the Cutts family, who's the congressman from Saco in the early 1800s, goes to Washington, and he actually marries this cute young thing who's Dolly Madison's sister and brings her back to Saco, Maine. So the politics here have always been very different, but they've always been in response to Massachusetts. And that's why it's so much fun.
Someone wants to get a jump on that book about King William's War. They asked, was that the trigger for the first paper money being printed in the Western world, the Massachusetts 40 pence note?
Yeah, and you can actually read about that. A few years ago, John Reed and I oh gosh, more like 25 years ago, I guess, wrote a biography of Sir William Phipps called The New England Knight. And it's out of print, but it's available at better libraries. And it talks, it gives a biography of Phipps, and it does include that. Phipps is chosen to lead the expedition essentially against Acadia, which he captures almost without a gun shot going off. But then he leads a major expedition of 34 ships and about 2,500 men and soldiers and sailors against Quebec, fails miserably, loses 4 ships on the return, loses 100 dead from smallpox. And yes, it is that point that Massachusetts is so broke that they issue the first paper money, which they, not being really good economists and not understanding things like inflation, basically pretty much ruins the Massachusetts economy for the foreseeable future for the length of the war, at least. Yeah, that's where it all started. But there's a chapter in that, which is a good starting point, at least, and talks a bit about some of those episodes of the war. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time if anyone wants to put in a last question. It's a little bit of time to get typing in there. Let me make sure I have hit everything. We have a couple of people who are descendants of some of the people you're speaking about. Someone descended from Richard Nason, who was a selectman with Nicholas Shapley.
Yep. Richard Nason lived about where the Hamilton House is, maybe a little south of there in South Berwick, maybe more towards Vaughan Woods than the Hamilton House. But yep, leading family.
And someone descended from Thomas Spencer and Patience Chadbourne.
Awesome. Yeah, the Chadbourne Family Association was very active in supporting the dig, as I say in the day. And in fact, they don't exist as an organization anymore, but they actually supported the exhibit. And in fact, if you don't know it, there is a really good genealogy of the Chadbourne family that they put together that again is a wonderful resource on the family in that region. So highly, highly recommended. Yeah.
So if people would like to go up to this region of Maine, what's like a good 1 or 2 places they could go to investigate this more, to see it?
Well,
I guess even a site that might be open.
Yeah, I was going to say, unfortunately, we tend to be a lot more seasonal in our tourism up here than you folks are down there, I think. But some of my favorite places to see 17th century northern New England. Again, there you can actually catch a midnight or a holiday stroll at Strawberry Bank. Strawberry Bank, of course, has the Sherborne House, which was built about 1690, and is one of the few surviving 17th century houses in New Hampshire. Historic New England has the Jackson House, the oldest house in New Hampshire, built about 1664, and they keep it as a study house, so it's in pretty good shape. It's not open all that often, so you have to, join Historic New England and look for when they're going to have it open. They usually have like a fall harvest festival there. The Counting House Museum in South Berwick is open seasonally, but they just pretty much close down at the end of October, but they usually open weekends. And they have, again, we have a permanent installation telling part of the story and some of these artifacts on display. What am I missing? I'm missing something. I talked about Strawberry Bank. I talked about, Pemaquid, of course. So one of my absolutely favorite place on this or any other planet, Colonial Pemaquid State Park, is just an absolutely beautiful place where they have the archaeological remains of 17th century Pemaquid, including the reconstructed tower of Fort William Henry, which is the fort that Phipps built in 1692 when he was up here during the witch trials. And they have a small museum there. They've excavated dozens of cellar holes and sites from the 17th century, thousands of artifacts. And again, is a state park that's open seasonally. You check their list, but certainly like June through at least through mid-September are open, and is probably the single best place to see the region in the 17th century. And I'm sure I'm missing other places as well too. I also like Old York Historical Society, great deal. Have some wonderful materials dating from the early 18th century, including the jail, of course, which is 1719, is the oldest jail left in the United States. But unfortunately, in most of these places, between the oldest standing building in Maine was built in 1707, right? Because everything was wiped out by wave of warfare, and also the fact that they were building these crummy earth-fast houses which weren't designed to last. But that should give you a few pointers. But unfortunately, I think for pretty much all of those, you're almost going to have to wait until I think next summer of a lovely field trip up to Maine. And when you're at Pemaquid, Also, we in York think that we have the best lighthouse up here, but also too, Pemaquid Point Light is absolutely spectacular. Highly recommended.
Are there any indigenous histories included in these sites or separate sites?
Yes, absolutely. And the other, speaking of which, but the place that tells, of course, there are remaining tribes in Maine, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy. There's also Holton Band of the Maliseet. There's some Micmac as well too, but some much more further north presence. The places I would recommend to go from there, the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor is a wonderful museum of Native Americans of particularly of Maine, but also of the Northeast. And they work very, very closely with the native populations. Again, Bar Harbor, wonderful place to go in the summer. And again, I think you could look online. I think they've pretty much closed for the season now. They always have seasonal exhibits and sometimes lots of really wonderful crafts by Native American artisans on display as well too. Highly, highly, highly recommended. Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you, Lori.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tad. That's the end of our time now. And again, as we said, this recording will be up on our website at historicbostons.org very soon. And you can always visit our website to find out about anything else happening with the partnership and to learn more about what we do. But for tonight, just want to thank you again, Tad Baker, for sharing this time with us and for your presentation.